Laura believed she had built a fortress around her life, solid, safe, and untouchable. For 15 years, her marriage to Mark had been her anchor. They shared everything. Quiet mornings over coffee, laughter with their children, and dreams for the future. It was a life that many envied and one she cherished deeply. But sometimes, the strongest walls can crack in the simplest moments. It was a Tuesday afternoon when Laura sat on her favorite corner of the sofa, sipping tea and scrolling through her phone. Mark was at work, the kids were at school, and the house hummed with a rare, comforting silence. The handyman, a young man of 25, had arrived earlier to fix a leaky faucet. A routine job, one Laura thought nothing of. Yet as the minutes passed, the atmosphere in the house began to change. Subtle things. A shift in how the sunlight seemed to fall through the curtains. The faint echo of footsteps in the hallway that felt different. And then, as Laura settled back into the cushions, something happened. Something that would unravel her world in ways she could never have imagined. This story isn't about a single moment, but a series of choices, actions, and discoveries that shattered a family's trust. What unfolded over the next few weeks would expose truths that had been hidden in plain sight. Truths that, once revealed, would leave Laura questioning everything she thought she knew about loyalty, love, and the people closest to her asterisk. What would you do if your most trusted relationships came undone? Not by chance, but by the deliberate actions of someone you let into your life. Stay with me as we uncover the full story, piece by piece. Laura and Mark had what many people envied, a life built on years of shared experiences. They weren't just husband and wife, they were partners. Together, they raised 2 children, supported each other's dreams, and grew their small, tight-knit family into something that felt unshakable. For 15 years, they had known each other's hopes, fears, and routines. They knew the little things. The sound of Mark's boots when he came home after a long day, the way Laura would hum to herself while making dinner, the exact spot on the couch they each claimed every evening while watching TV. Life felt predictable, comforting, safe. But what happens when that sense of safety is shattered in the blink of an eye? Laura, a loving stay-at-home mom, had always been the heartbeat of their home. She managed everything, from the kids' schedules to the house chores. She was the one who knew what the house needed before anyone else did. Mark, her husband, worked long hours as a mechanic, rarely home during the day, but always making sure the family had everything they needed. They had their routines, and each day unfolded just like the one before it. But as anyone who's been in a long relationship knows, there are moments when life becomes monotonous. That's when the small things begin to feel like a relief, a change, even if just for a few minutes. And so, when a minor issue arose in the house, a leaking pipe in the bathroom, it was nothing unusual. Laura had seen the handyman's flyer before. He'd fixed a few small things around the house over the last year. A fresh face, easy to work with and reliable. It was simple enough to call him in. What started as an ordinary, routine repair soon shifted. It wasn't until the handyman arrived that Laura began to feel that odd, subtle shift in the air, as if the entire day had a strange weight to it that she couldn't place. The man was polite, competent even, but there was something about his presence that felt different. Perhaps it was just her imagination, but Laura couldn't help but notice the way he lingered when he spoke, how he glanced at her a little longer than what felt appropriate. The fact was, she had never thought to question the people she let into their home. After all, Mark and Laura had built their lives around trust. Trust in each other, trust in their surroundings, and yes, even in the people they brought in to help. But as the handyman worked in the bathroom, something was quietly shifting beneath the surface. Neither Laura nor Mark had any idea how the course of their life was about to be altered forever. As Laura sat in the living room, sipping her coffee and glancing through the window, everything seemed calm, as if this moment were no different from the many that had come before it. But sometimes, when you least expect it, the simplest decisions can create the greatest consequences. For the first few days, everything seemed completely ordinary. The handyman worked tirelessly, diligently fixing the plumbing issues that had been a minor nuisance for the past week. Laura, as usual, kept herself busy around the house. There was nothing in his behavior that raised suspicion. Nothing, that is, until the small moments began to stack up, each one more unsettling than the last. At first, it was nothing more than a slight discomfort, an odd feeling that something wasn't right. He would look at her a little too long when they spoke, his gaze lingering in a way that made her uncomfortable. The first few times she dismissed it. Maybe it was just her imagination. Maybe she was reading too much into a simple interaction. But the more time he spent in the house, the more these fleeting moments began to accumulate. He would make little compliments that felt out of place. Compliments about how the house always looked so inviting, or how her smile was contagious. Simple words, harmless in themselves, but something about the way he said them made Laura uneasy. She started to feel as though she were walking a tightrope, carefully managing every conversation. And still, she couldn't shake the feeling that his presence was more than just that of a contractor. Something about him felt different. But it wasn't until the day Laura sat down on the sofa that everything took a sharp, unforgettable turn. The handyman had finished his work for the day, and as he gathered his tools to leave, he paused by the doorway. A moment of silence hung in the air as he looked at her. Laura, still sitting on the sofa, tried to maintain her composure, but the way he stood there, lingering just a little too long, seemed to stretch time. Then, without saying a word, he left. The door clicked shut behind him. But that simple moment, that seemingly innocent exchange, would later come to symbolize the first crack in the foundation of her world. Back at home, Mark had been oblivious to the tension growing between Laura and the handyman. But as the days passed, he began noticing subtle changes in Laura's behavior. Little things, secretive phone calls when he wasn't around, quick glances at her phone when he entered a room, the way she would shut down any conversation that veered into unfamiliar territory. Mark wasn't one to pry, but as the distance between them grew, so did the suspicion. One evening, he came home after a long day at work. The house was quiet, too quiet. He found Laura in the living room, her phone held tightly in her hand, a strained look on her face as she quickly tucked the device into her pocket when she saw him. The conversation she had been having on the phone ended abruptly, leaving only the awkward silence in its place. He tried to shake it off, but he couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his gut. There were no major confrontations yet, no explicit signs of betrayal. But something in Laura's eyes told him everything he needed to know. Something was shifting, and he wasn't sure how to stop it. Then came the day that changed everything. Mark, coming home early to surprise Laura, entered the house without a sound. As he stepped into the hallway, he heard soft voices coming from the living room. The handyman, his name was Jason, was standing just inside the door. The air was thick with unspoken tension. Laura was on the sofa, arms crossed, her eyes flicking nervously between Jason and the doorway. The moment she saw Mark, she froze, her face pale. Jason, too, seemed to tense up, his hand brushing the back of the sofa in an odd, deliberate gesture. Mark didn't need to ask what was going on. He could feel the shift in the room, the weight of something unspoken hanging between them. But Laura, with a forced smile, quickly explained that Jason had just finished up some work around the house. Mark nodded, but the uneasy knot in his stomach only tightened. As days passed, the uneasy interactions continued. The tension was now visible to both of them. Laura had become more guarded, more distant, while Mark began to feel a growing unease whenever he was around her. The texts that Laura sent, the late-night phone calls she insisted on taking outside, and the way she would avoid eye contact during their conversations, all of it started to add up. But the real breaking point, the moment that would turn everything upside down, was still to come. The more Mark watched, the more he realized that something wasn't adding up. It wasn't just the handyman's presence. It wasn't just Laura's strange behavior. It was the way everything seemed so rehearsed, so deliberate. The house had always been their sanctuary, but now, every corner, every room felt colder, more foreign. And what Mark was about to discover next would leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about his wife, his home, and the life they had built together. Mark had always trusted his instincts. And one evening, as he sat in the dimly lit kitchen, staring at his reflection in the window, something inside him told him that there was more to the story. Maybe it was the way Laura avoided his gaze, or the way Jason had been acting ever since the day he stepped into their home. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening right under his nose, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. That night, Mark did something he had never done before. He picked up Laura's phone, her phone, which she had left on the kitchen counter in a rare moment of distraction. His heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't stop himself. He unlocked it, his thumb trembling as he swiped through the messages. At first, it was just casual texts, nothing that would raise suspicion. But then, hidden in plain sight, he found a thread of conversation between Laura and the handyman Jason. The words on the screen were simple enough at first glance, but the context was undeniable. Flirty messages, compliments, messages that went beyond just friendly exchanges about plumbing issues. There were invitations, suggestions for late-night meetings, and hints at something far more personal. Each message sent a wave of cold shock through Mark's veins. His hand shook as he scrolled through the entire thread, reading the messages again and again, desperate to understand how this had happened right under his roof. But what made it even worse, what made his blood run cold, was not just the betrayal of trust. It was what was hidden in the subtext of those messages. Laura had known what she was doing. She had been lying, carefully covering up her actions with calculated words and secret encounters. Mark could feel the weight of it all. The betrayal of his wife, the man who had entered his life, and the realization that his world was crumbling before his eyes. With the phone still in his trembling hands, Mark took a deep breath. He didn't know what to do next, but one thing was clear: he couldn't let this slide. It wasn't just the infidelity that shattered him. It was the complete breakdown of trust. He had always believed in their bond, their connection. Now all of that seemed like a lie. As the hours ticked by, Mark's mind raced. He knew that a confrontation was inevitable. He couldn't live with this knowledge festering inside him, unable to confront the source of his pain. And so, with an almost mechanical resolve, he waited until the following morning. Laura was in the kitchen making breakfast, acting as if nothing was wrong, her usual routine, her calm demeanor. But Mark was no longer calm. His world had turned upside down, and he had to face her. "Laura," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to talk." Laura froze, her back still turned to him. For a moment, she didn't respond. Mark could see her shoulders tense, the muscles in her neck tightening. Without turning around, she muttered, "About what?" Mark stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest, the phone still clutched in his hand. "About Jason," he said. "About everything." Her body stiffened, and Mark knew instantly. She knew exactly what he was referring to. Her hands trembled as she placed the spatula down on the counter, and for the first time in their marriage, she didn't meet his gaze. "How long?" Mark asked, his voice barely holding steady. The silence between them was deafening. Finally, Laura spoke, her voice low, almost apologetic. "Mark, she faltered, unable to form the words she so desperately needed to say. The phone in his hand felt heavier with every passing second. Mark's eyes, bloodshot with exhaustion and anger, never left her face. He needed answers, and he needed them now. "How long has this been going on?" he demanded, the raw emotion in his voice breaking through the calm facade she had been maintaining. Laura's face flushed, her hands now gripping the edge of the counter as though holding herself steady. It was just one mistake, a moment of weakness. It meant nothing, she stammered, but her voice lacked conviction. One mistake, a moment of weakness. Mark could feel the weight of her words press on his chest, but he couldn't bring himself to believe them. This wasn't just a simple mistake. It was a betrayal that had been building for weeks, maybe longer. "This isn't just about the affair, Laura," Mark said quietly, his tone ice-cold now. "This is about everything. This is about how you lied, how you've been hiding things from me." Laura's face crumpled in guilt, and Mark's anger surged. "I don't know who you are anymore." His voice cracked, but he stood his ground. "What else aren't you telling me?" But then, just as the words hung in the air, the doorbell rang. Both of them froze. Mark didn't move, his eyes still locked onto Laura's face. He saw the panic flash in her eyes, the briefest glimpse of something that spoke of guilt, of fear. "Who is it?" Mark demanded. Laura hesitated, then whispered, "It's Jason." In that instant, Mark felt his whole world crumble. The man who had wormed his way into their home, the one who had destroyed everything, was standing at their door. Mark couldn't believe it. The phone, the text, the lie, it was all coming to a head. He had to make a choice. Confront Jason. Confront Laura. But what would it change? What did he even want to know anymore? With a deep breath, Mark made his decision. He walked to the door, his pulse racing with anger and confusion. As he swung it open, he came face to face with the man who had shattered his life. Jason stood there, his smile faltering the moment he saw Mark's expression. Mark didn't say a word. Instead, he just looked at Jason, the weight of everything he had discovered crashing down on him. Jason's eyes flickered, guilt washing over his face. But before he could say a word, Mark slammed the door shut. Laura, standing behind him, let out a small gasp. "Mark, please." But Mark wasn't listening. Not anymore. The twist had only just begun. The man who had betrayed him was still standing outside, and the woman who had once promised to be his everything was standing behind him, helpless, just as broken as he was. But the real shock, the real betrayal, was still to come. After everything had exploded into chaos, after the phone call, the texts, and the confrontation, Laura knew the truth was out. There was no more hiding. There was no more pretending that everything was fine. And so, as the days passed, Laura found herself sitting alone in the same house where she and Mark had once built a life, a family. The weight of her guilt pressed on her chest like a heavy stone. She knew she had betrayed the man who had loved her for over a decade, the man who had been by her side through thick and thin. And now, in the empty silence of their once happy home, she had no choice but to face what she had done. It was late one night, after Mark had left to stay at a friend's house, that Laura called him. Her voice was broken, trembling, barely above a whisper. "I've told you the truth about everything," she said, her words laced with shame. "I never meant for it to go this far." Mark, standing on the other end of the phone, didn't say anything at first. His silence was deafening. He was no longer the man who had been willing to fight for their marriage. The trust had been shattered, and with each passing second, it became clearer to him that there was no going back. "Laura," he finally said, his voice steady but filled with sorrow, "we can't fix this." For Mark, the decision had already been made. His heart ached, his mind filled with an overwhelming sense of loss, but he knew there was no way to repair the damage. The love that once existed between them had turned into something unrecognizable, a bitter, painful reality that neither of them could ignore. Laura, her head hung low, broke down in sobs as Mark's words sank in. She had lost everything: her family, her home, and the love she once cherished. Mark took the final steps that would sever the ties completely. He packed his bags and left the house they had shared. The sound of his suitcase rolling across the floor echoed through the empty rooms. He didn't look back as he closed the door behind him for the last time. Cut to a slow montage of Mark leaving the house, his suitcase in hand, his face a mix of determination and devastation. A soft, mournful melody plays in the background. But even as Mark walked away, the echoes of what had happened still lingered. The betrayal wasn't just about infidelity. It was about the loss of trust, the erosion of something that had once seemed unbreakable. It was about the realization that sometimes, no matter how much you try, some things cannot be fixed. No matter how much you want to pretend everything is fine, the truth always comes out. Laura sat in the living room alone, surrounded by the remnants of a life she had destroyed. The silence was deafening. The life she had built with Mark, the future they had dreamed of, was now shattered beyond recognition. In the days that followed, they both tried to navigate the aftermath in their own way. Mark found solace in the support of friends and family, slowly rebuilding the pieces of his life. For Laura, the reality of her actions set in. She sought therapy, trying to make sense of the choices that had led her down this dark path. But no amount of counseling or self-reflection could undo what had been done. She had hurt the one person who had always been there for her. And then, just as the emotional weight of it all seemed too much to bear, the inevitable came. The divorce papers arrived. The divorce wasn't just the end of a marriage, it was the end of an era. They were no longer the couple who had once been inseparable. They were strangers now, bound only by the memories of what once was, and the pain of what could never be again. This story, as painful as it is, serves as a reminder of the importance of trust, of transparency, and of being vigilant in the face of red flags. Infidelity is never just a one-time slip. It is the culmination of a series of choices. Each action, each lie, each moment of neglect builds up over time until it becomes irreversible damage. The lessons here are clear. We must address issues before they fester, before they grow into something that cannot be undone. We must communicate openly, confront the things we're afraid to face, and above all, we must trust our instincts. If anything can be learned from this story, it is that trust, once broken, can never be fully repaired. The scars left by betrayal are deep, and they stay with you long after the dust settles. But there is always hope. Hope for healing, for growth, and for new beginnings. In the end, both Mark and Laura had to face the consequences of their actions. But what followed was the opportunity for each of them to rebuild, to find the strength to move forward, and to learn from the mistakes that had shattered their lives. The question remains, what will you do when faced with the truth? Will you confront it head-on? Or will you let the lies continue to grow until it's too late? As the final chapter of Laura and Mark's story draws to a close, we're left with a question that lingers in the air. Was Laura's betrayal something that could ever be forgiven? Or did Mark make the right decision in walking away, in choosing to preserve what was left of his dignity and self-respect? What would you have done in his place? We want to hear from you. Was there a moment in the story that resonated with you? Can you relate to the pain of betrayal, or maybe even the weight of a difficult choice? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Your insights might help someone who's struggling with their own version of this heartbreaking dilemma. Remember, you're not alone and your voice matters. And if you've ever been through something similar, whether it's betrayal, heartache, or the aftermath of a relationship falling apart, your story could offer comfort to others who feel isolated. Sometimes, sharing your experience is a first step toward healing. Leave your story in the comments, and let's continue the conversation. If you found this story as gripping as we did, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more real, unfiltered, true stories like this one. We bring you gripping narratives that keep you on the edge of your seat, and you won't want to miss a single one. Turn on notifications so you're the first to know when we release a new video. And if this story got you thinking, make sure to check out the other videos we've linked right here. You can find more heartbreaking tales of betrayal, stories of love lost, and the powerful lessons they teach us. Just click on the video you see on your screen and get lost in the truth that lies beyond every frame.